Good evening. Today is Thursday, March 24, 2022, and there's a special 90th episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. Today, my good friend Flavius Mihaies is here to talk as part of one of two on Russia and the future of NATO. Flavius is a journalist, investigative journalist, consultant, and he has just returned from a trip from Romania, which shares 600-kilometer border with Ukraine. Journalism really focuses on the conflict, impact of economic sanctions, and the experience of minorities. Flavius previously has worked for the U.S. Congress, think tanks, international organizations, and private sector on the elaboration, implementation, and also analysis of foreign policy and development assistance. He is a contributor to Huffington Post, the Atlantic Council, and Al Jazeera. He recently traveled to the Middle East, where he was in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. He worked in a Syrian refugee camp and toured towns in the Syrian Kurdish region, and also visited the local Christian communities. He is completing a book currently on Syria. Flavius, it's good to have you here, buddy. I'm glad we had an opportunity, especially today being the 1 month mark of when initially President Biden announced sanctions against Russia because of the invasions of Ukraine, and because of the fact that he's today in Brussels, we're talking with NATO as to what the next steps are going to be. So it's good to have you here with your experience.
Thank you, Colonel. It's good to be here. Coincidentally, this year is a year since the beginning of the U.S. involvement in Syria to support the rebels seeking to overthrow President Assad. So there's a lot of dates here.
Flavius, I know you have a lot of experience, especially with how the sanctions worked in Syria, specifically what are some of the consequences or not. I do know that we're, 30 days moved now from where we used to be. The globe is experiencing even an issue of possible, as President Biden spoke about today, a global pandemic. I do want to kind of play two of the sound bites of what he had initially talked to reporters about today and kind of get your take on it before we continue with your presentation today. So if you can get those two videos queued up.
Nothing more to report. With regard to food shortages, yes, we did talk about food shortages. And it's going to be real. The price of these sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia. It's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well.
And then also, do you think that Russia needs to be removed from the G20?
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe.
Well, Flavius, you kind of heard the POTUS. It's funny because the administration initially, everybody was saying that, sanctions were going to be applied against Russia, and these are very severe sanctions. And of course, this 27 nations of the EU had to approve the sanctions. Not one could have disapproved them. And, everybody was saying that there are deterrents. And today, of course, President Biden, does a complete reversal and says they're never going to be a deterrence. What's your take overall where we are right now, 30 days into this conflict with when it comes to these sanction issues?
Well, thank you, Colonel. Well, I think the lack of clarity is reflecting the tool that the sanctions are. And if you allow me to take a step back and take the long view, sanctions do not have a pretty good track record in terms of as a policy tool, starting with Cuba, moving on to Iran, etc. In fact, when I was in Lebanon last June, the local activists, the democracy activists, were complaining about the use of sanctions, arguing that it's the little guy who get caught, and they send the names, or they provide the names to the Americans to sort of being a good implementer of the sanction. The big guys are warned in advance, and the bank is the money is out of the target when by the time the sanctions are in place. And this is something that it's pretty well known in the community, in the analyst community around the world. But at the same time, I understand that given the public pressure and the way the media has been covering the war and other wars, only this conflict, it's a policy tool that is second best to sending boots on the ground. So I understand the appeal of that sanctions package.
No, look, I understand exactly what you're saying, especially given the fact that just a couple of days ago you had the Lebanese head of banking, being basically prosecuted. But some people say it was because the president of the country of Lebanon really wasn't able to launder money through him, so he decided, hey, I'm going to remove and put my guy in. And I have reminded people before, I was interviewed just a week ago, and I said, keep in mind that Cuba outlasted the Soviet Union and outlasted all the sanctions that have been put against it since Castro took over. And even after his death, it has still outlived the sanctions. And just recently, as of a month ago, strong a new agreement with the Chinese Communist Party and the China on a Belt and Road Initiative. So it is what it is. It's just the reality of it. But we're going to have to see how the whole sanction process is going to work out on this.
Well, I must say though that I was in transit between Romania, France, and back to America at the beginning of the war. I must say that I was quite surprised by the speed and the reach of the sanction. In a couple of days, we went to a swift ban, which one might discuss the efficiency of that the measure. But when you think of other conflict or other sanction regimes with Syria and Iran, this is what sanction attorney would call the nuclear option, no pun intended, and the sort of last resort when you are de-dollarizing. So there's probably going to be, or likely could be an effect, but also 30 days is too short. We haven't seen evidence that people are not, beside accessing Netflix, which may be a good thing, they don't have Netflix. We haven't seen people being so affected in terms of the basic goods.
No, I think, look, we're going to have you back on part 2 of this discussion, and we're going to do a deeper dive on the sanction issues and next Thursday, same time. But I know you have some slides. We're going to initially look at how the heck we got here as far as the path to war is concerned. And maybe that gives us a little bit of a clarification why we are where we are today, and then see how we can maybe dissect where we're going to be at in the long run. So let's go ahead and cue up your slides, and you got the floor, my friend.
Next, please. Yeah, thanks so much. Well, this is an impression, as you mentioned, it's only 30 days. This is sort of the first take that I can my observation coming from the Syrian experience that I can share. But as we said earlier, we will have to see in the longer term how things are playing out. But the first reference point was the Syrian conflict. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, this is a 10-year that the Americans have been involved, first by supporting rebels in 2012 through the CIA initially. Next, the rebels were funded through a covert program that spent millions of dollars to train and equip. In 2014, we started coming out that, we didn't necessarily work with the good guys. And that led in 2017, President Trump to end the arms support for the rebels. So when you see the U.S. administration jumping in, we will provide a significant arms support to this is fine, and this probably sounds like the moral thing to do. No, it's hard for folks, including for myself, before I went to a war zone, to understand that when you are sending arms to a conflict zone and you have a national army that is relying on militias or rebels, these are groups that are not under the command and control of the government. And we've seen in in Ukraine since for the last few years, that is the most engaged in the conflict with Russia. Individuals are part of those paramilitary militias, and you don't have command and control. You have people who are extremely ideologically committed, and that's not necessarily a good mix, to say the least. Next slide. If we can go to the next. Next. This is some of the headlines about the experience funding armed groups, whatever you call them, militias or rebels in Syria. And if you go forward next, please. Here. And there is something peculiar, I think, to this conflict from a European, especially French perspective, and that is something perhaps that I can, from my experience, the experience of French who have been in school in France, you're not talking about any fascist group here. The insignia of that paramilitary group, the Battalion Azov, is bringing some horrific and pretty bloody memories for anyone who is French. The origin, as you can see on the screen, it's in French, but the pictures are the same. This Panzer, this SS division is not any SS division. It was the most brutal division, Das Reich. And when you go to school in France, in high school as a high school student, you cannot ignore in your history course that the end of the war was marked by a massacre that this division committed on innocent civilians in a village in France called Oradour-sur-Glane. That name, Oradour-sur-Glane, became the symbol of that barbaric act. People were hanged to the poles and to the road lights. It was terrible, and I understand. For Americans, this is not evocating anything. It's the same way that when you had the protests, in Charlottesville, for example, or the right-wing protests in America, we in Europe saw funny flags. It didn't necessarily evoke the same history, but when you are in the European context and you see those insignia, it's painful, to say the least, and it's not. It's a warning, and even if you can argue these are small units, as we know, the most ideologically committed are on the front line and are disproportionately involved in the fighting. And this is, to me, a parallel that you can make with Syria, in the sense that you have those groups who are extremely ideologically committed, who are willing to die, and they don't necessarily have a good track record. So we'll see how that play out. But I think it's important to understand that we don't have the command and control in the Ukraine military the same way American can think of the US or France or Italy, etc. You have an army that is relatively small that is supported and need those outside groups, paramilitary groups, and it has few control on their actions.
No, look, I understand what you're saying, because one of the things that we ran into in Syria was the YPG. And the YPG is actually a socialist group that was conducting terrorist attacks inside of Turkey, which is the reason why Turkey also wanted to clean them out. Unfortunately for us, because we were trying to get weapons and supply, because we were fighting against Assad, we were in a position where we initially were giving the weapon and funding, and realized if we do it that way, we're funding a terrorist organization that is actually conducting operations inside of a NATO ally, in this case, Turkey. So instead of that, we created the so-called separate entities, and we started funneling money through Iraq into those pockets in Syria. So we do this all the time. And I think for what you're trying to point out is that this is one of the problems that you walk into when you're trying to do these type of hybrid war operations that even the U.S. has been involved in. I had written a series of articles, Backyard Wars, for the Daily Herald, talking about how future war is actually kind of looking at changing, and why nations are fighting these backyard wars using non-conventional force structures. The Azov battalion that you have here is currently right now fighting in Ukraine and is actually being funded and given weapon systems by us. But that same Azov regiment, which was formed in 2014, in September, it was put on the Ministry of Interior for Ukraine. In 2019, they had such a bad reputation that the U.S. Congress actually was going to designate them as a terrorist organization. But unfortunately, we came to find out by the reply that came to us from the Ukrainian government through the Ministry of Interior and their defense structures that actually this is a unit that was being funded by our Department of Defense monies. So Congress was shocked, but it was stuck in a position and couldn't go after them. So right now you actually have an organizational structure on the ground fighting against the Russians, trying to repel them from the invasion of Ukraine that actually was going to be put on a terrorist list in 2019 by Congress. And Senator Engel couldn't do it because he was stuck, realizing that we were funding him. So I think that's one of the issues you run into about these type of operations that take place.
Again, I don't blame a leader who is desperate and fighting an unbalanced fight against Russia, but as supporter of that effort, understanding the granularity of how this is playing out is important. There's a memory, as I mentioned, involved with those groups, and perhaps we could have done more efforts through diplomacy to avoid having to get there. Next. Another interesting comparative aspect when you come from Europe is the Russia that is portrayed often, and it is the aggressor. There is absolutely no doubt about it. This is not the mighty warrior of the Cold War. Simply looking at the demography next, Russia has been bleeding population. At the outset of communism, the average life expectancy for men were 59. It hasn't improved. In fact, it's losing more. Next, it's losing more people. And this is not immigration. These are conditions people don't make children. The future doesn't look bright. There's infant mortality, and it's beyond next. It's beyond the replacement level. And in fact, the projections that both the Syrian government and the UNDP came up with is on average next. Previous to the
previous slide.
Yeah, previous. The projections are that by 2050, the Russian population, which is now around 120, 30, around that number, can go as low as 75 million Syrian Russians. And so you have a country that have a vast territory, a shrinking population, and that has not been able to overcome the challenge of the transition that other countries like Poland and others have been assisted to do so. And you cannot blame everything on Putin. Putin arrived 10 years after the end of communism. We can actually go straight to that part because it's a nice lead up. Who are the member of NATO now? You have the founder members were the Western European, as we know the story, and America has definitely provided that security and that allowed peace and this European nation to thrive. Now, when NATO brought these new members, they came with their baggage. And for example, you mentioned Romania. My parents come from Romania. Let me tell you, the last thing they want is to have the Russian boot on their neck again. But it means also that the decision making of NATO will be also in part driven by these new members, and these new members have a score to settle with Russia, and they have legitimate fears. Absolutely, they have scores to settle. There's this past that is still very much present. The generation is still alive, some of them, and that has affected how NATO so picks up its next battle and driven it toward a more aggressive stance toward Russia. There's no question about that. You bring those members who have suffered, as Anthony Snyder, the Harvard historian, called the region bloodland for sure. But you bring in the dynamic members who come with that experience and with that fear and with that drive to and perspective expressed against Russia, and that's not something to helpful to ignore.
No, look, I understand exactly what you're saying, and the issue is that it was really the Baltic nations are really the driver behind wanting us to do more against Russia, because they really want to see Russia bleed. Unfortunately, Russia's bleeding out inside of Ukraine. Even when you shoot the Russian aircrafts, they're crashing down on Ukraine. When you're killing a Russian soldier, those bullets are entering his body and exiting in Ukraine. Recently, just today, when the Russian ship was sunk, it was sunk in a Ukrainian port. So Ukraine's being absolutely destroyed. We are in the 2 million refugees. The women and children are being funneled into those Baltic nations. And really, when I set up the company Near East Center in 2014, the first year anniversary article that I wrote was about how Turkey was using the refugees as a weapon to hold Europe hostage. If you think about it, there are more refugees flowing in now, even into Latvia, than you even have Latvians in Latvia, because majority of the Latvians were leaving Latvia because they couldn't sustain themselves inside of the country because of the economics and also other issues that they were dealing with. And now, even this push is really pushing a lot of other Russian speakers, Slavs, into these nations. Is going to change what their dynamics are going to look like. You being French, you should know that where France before Napoleon was number 3 on the in the world as far as population was concerned. And after the Napoleonic Wars, really lost in the millions, and it completely shattered what the demography of France looked like. And this war, as we're seeing transition, it's really changing the entire landscape of what Europe is going to look like, given the refugee crisis, not just from the Middle East that has poured into Europe, but what is now coming through Ukraine. Is it valid to say that Europe is pretty much broken because of what is happening with this migration movement into the Baltics and into the main heartland of Europe?
I mean, it's as you mentioned earlier, it's hard to tell. We are 30 days into it. The numbers in there are worrisome of refugees. Now, if you look at the Syrian conflict, as you mentioned about Turkey, I've heard great stories about Germany, for example, the way they had the program to ensure that the refugees would learn German, learn a trade. So there are ways to have a meaningful resolution of this refugee crisis. But indeed, some in France, when they see the conflict that is not turning into a stalemate because of that, in part because of that shipping weapons to war zone, they wonder, if you talk about NATO, who is more of the national security threat, Russia, or purely from the NATO member perspective, Russia, or country, as you mentioned, like Turkey, who has played that politics of opening the floodgates of the refugees, and as the large majority of the terrorists who struck France in 2016 had come through that smuggling routes that Turkey had left open, and all the destabilization that it provides. So some would tell you, I mean, look, if you talk about the national security issue, like who is more of a concern? And indeniably, now there are war crimes committed in Ukraine. If that's obviously an Amnesty International report, or others, absolutely there should be prosecution. And in fact, the activists, the democracy activists, again from my Middle Eastern experience, would tell you is like this criminal investigation and these sanctions against individuals. Lebanese was referring to a story where you have some generals in the Israeli army who cannot fly to London today. These works there toward individuals, and that can change behavior, at least on some of these individuals. But the blanket sanction is we will talk next week, but doesn't seem to be producing results. One quick note: this is often presented as two actors, but Ukrainian and Russian are the same in many ways. Russians are married with Ukrainians, and the sanctions against Russia will also affect Ukrainians. So a family and Ukrainians would tell me, look, what we are more concerned about is Russians in Russia not protesting Putin actions, but we see that otherwise as a war of Russia against the West. And if you talk about Russia in terms of economic sanctions, it's probably not your best bet. Russians have the experience of going through hardship. That's what I heard also from Russians. Yes, the oligarch won't get their yacht, but Russians, when it comes to surviving, they have demonstrated a pretty good capacity to go through a hardship. And so again, that would play down the potential for these economic sanctions to produce any behavior change from the leadership in Russia.
Well, look, we just got the note today that Russia and Iran are looking at setting up their own exchange, which, of course, is being pushed by China, part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think I had put a little article together today on the Near East, and I said that, Ukrainian leadership has to understand the reason why NATO may be slow rolling their support for Ukraine is because they don't know how to counter China. And if Russia ends up, being diminished as a superpower, then it's going to put the entire Europe face to face with China. And I got to tell you, the first JCPOA that was signed under Obama, when I was asked about it, I said it was nothing more than an economic agreement to save Europe. And I think the push right now is to get that thing signed. And even having Russia negotiate on behalf of the United States is because we understand from the U.S. side, if it's not signed, you're not going to be able to save Europe. And if you can't save Europe and Russia goes by the wayside as far as its ability, with Putin maybe being on a short leash of maybe not surviving over the next couple of years, China takes over, but China now will realize that, well, if Russia's gone, they'll do the same thing to me. So I might as well move against them, and I'm going to move against them on an economic level where I can absolutely destroy their dollars. I mean, the Bank of Japan owns billions of dollars of U.S. debt. It's not a joke how much money is owned by others of our debt. And when you got the Russians, or I should say the Saudis, talking about picking up the oil, shipping it to China and using the Chinese currency. Maybe the Chinese currency doesn't have the weight right now because the U.S. dollar is still being used by everybody to trade oil, but they're starting to set themselves up in a position to realize that if suddenly Russia is diminished as a superpower because of this fight, then guess what happens? Then you're going to have to go against Europe. And I don't think Europe is prepared for this economic fight. And as I was interviewed on Newsmax almost a month ago now, as soon as the war started, I said, I don't think we're ready to fight this fight. I don't know what your take is, because you know exactly, especially with your experience of how sanctions worked in Syria. One thing that was always stated is that the banking system in Syria really withstood the ability of still being able to be functioning, even with all the destruction that was taking place. Is there any parallels here that you can learn from Ukraine? I know almost $190 billion in cryptocurrency moved into Ukraine just a couple of weeks ago. Is there anything here that is something that we're not seeing that you can maybe point out to us so we can start going down that path, and we'll look at it in more of a deep dive next week?
Absolutely. And a quick note on China. It's often seen and portrayed as an alliance between two brothers, the dictators' alliance. All right, but this is also a concern for Russia. Russia is European in its large majority, but not in terms of the territory necessarily, but in terms of its population on the European side. And with this conflict, China is having Russia at the bargain basement price. It shares a close to 3,000 miles border with Russia. You have a relation of 1 to 10 in terms of the population imbalance between on the Russian side and the Chinese side. And you had the conflict on the border that was not too long ago. So for Russia, it's not turning toward China. It hasn't been his first choice. If you look at the post-communist history, the first 10 years, Boris Yeltsin has tried to court the West and the US, including discussing a possible membership in NATO. So it's not a good thing for Russia itself and for Europe. The Russians see themselves, the culture of Tolstoy, etc., as European nation. So the pivot for them to Asia is not a natural. It's not part of their narrative, and that's one concern to keep in mind. We were not having two dictators equal dictators at the top shaking hands and sharing a common culture. Then, in terms of the sanctions and the intervention of different actors, what actually was interesting to see in that country is that you have private actor like Elon Musk stepping in to provide satellite power. Now that's great on paper. It sounds like they want to do something, but as you know, Colonel, the technology can be used for civilian and military, but also paramilitary purpose. And I encountered that in Syria when you had citizen work that I covered in my reporting, working to provide technical solutions to farming in area controlled by the Kurds and their allies. Providing internet raised some issues, because if you use internet for farming to the cloud and you connect different parts together to the internet, well, it can be also used for military purpose, right? So what is the accountability of a private actor like Elon Musk if his satellites are going to be used to commit atrocities? And that's a very real concern, right? I would say the sanctions and also the well-intended perhaps intervention of private citizens to help one party or the other outside the framework, who have the capacity of technology that mirror the state. The state outsource Elon Musk. It's a program, it's space program, correct? That is raising a host of issues in terms of the accountability and the use of those tools, the accountability, especially in a context where you have fragmented military, as we know, with fewer command and control than in an army like the NATO power. And again, I don't blame. There's a clear moral issue. There is a really the small guy who is taking the brunt of that. But these questions are well intended, perhaps, but that we might pay the price later. Should be addressed. You cannot even fight an enemy that you don't understand, and you cannot help a friend that you don't understand either.
No, look, I think those are some key things that you mentioned. Look, everybody said when Putin came in here that he may have overreached. Initially, even the U.S. systems and officials were saying that he's going to take over Ukraine within a couple of days. When you think about it now, even the people that have said he's overreached, I would have them look at it this way. Putin went in with the toys that he had, armor, capabilities, air, but the type of weapon systems that are out there now with AI and drones, they have almost made the armor obsolete. And we're learning that right on the battlefield now. And if you think about it, who's flying these type of drones and AI technology? It's some civilian doctor. The guy was a doctor or was a teacher just a couple of weeks ago, and now he has the ability of coordinating at the lower level with two people and attacking against a Russian armor and blowing it out of the water. And I got to tell you, I don't think the NATO folks are happy about it. And the multi-complex is now looking at it and saying, well, for God's sakes, I got this Bradley tank fighting vehicle. I have all these contracts for even Poland buying our Abrams. But if that Abrams is going to become null and void based on three people on the ground using these new AI and drone technologies, then it completely has changed what a future battlefield will look like. And we're going to start becoming, like you said, much more decentralized. And in that capacity, you're right. And Elon Musk today is helping the Ukrainians. Today, he may decide, well, I'm going to go ahead and use it to commit war atrocities and help an adversary rather than a friend. And then what are you going to do?
If I may, it's not even to get to such a probably not plausible scenario, but what control does Elon Musk has on his satellites once they are handed to Ukrainian groups? That's what we saw that in Syria, and we saw that with the weapons. But that just a satellite is not because it's not classified as a gun that cannot, as you mentioned, help coordinate target strikes. And we had that concern in Syria, meaning the group involved. It was a really ethical questions. If we help we help set up a network for civilian humanitarian purpose, what guarantees that the local militia, the Kurds or whoever is not going to then take that technology and use it for military purpose? And I have not seen any such conversation around the technology that is now being provided by folks like Elon Musk.
No. Look, even everybody's asking how come the Russians haven't conducted such a great cyber attack that they have that capability. They haven't even taken down the foreign services in Ukraine. The reason being because they're using the same foreign services to be able to communicate amongst the decentralized, leadership. I was in Al-Anbar, and I remember the Marines commander was yelling at the troops one day. He looked at me, he goes, "Did you know that the phone lines here in Al-Anbar works?" I go, "Yes." He goes, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I picked it up and I made a phone call from a place." I could have done that. His poor Marines, couldn't go out there and do some of the stuff I was doing. But, we kept it alive. We didn't shut it down because we said it's important. When there was a contract that was provided by the Iraqi government for new towers for cell technology. We had so many attacks that were taking place against the cell infrastructure. When we were asked, hey, how come there's an attack against these cell infrastructures? I said, because the company that wants to bring their cell towers in has to blow up these cell towers so it can win the bid contract with the Iraqi government in order to be able to replace their systems. And the same company was the same company that we had a government contract with the U.S. Service personnel inside of Kuwait. So every time one of our service personnel picked up and called home at that time from these little phone banks, guess what? They were using the cell tower of the company that was blowing up cell towers in Al-Anbar in order to win a contract to replace those cell towers with their own with the Iraqi government. So, this stuff has happened in the past for the guys who've been on the battlefield, and it's still happening now, even in Ukraine, as Ukraine is being destroyed. So it's absolutely a unique environment. I do want to go ahead, buddy.
I would. Sorry. No, just a quick notice. I would like to see, because indeed, if you hear folks from the military or from the intelligence, they will indeed show those concerns. I would like to see that conversation on the policy making side. When you are handing out that much support, what is your contingency plan, or what are your scenarios for such possibilities? It's not so much not to support our friends, but I would like to see a conversation. How have you thought through those risks, those very real risks and experience that we had in previous conflict or other conflicts?
No, I will tell you, nobody talks through these things, and unless you're on the ground, you're not seeing some of this stuff. The same issues get repeated over and over again.
Right. Exactly.
So I don't know where we're going to be. All I know is, Ukraine's infrastructure is being destroyed. You have all these mass immigrants flooding into these Baltic nations that cannot handle them. The same Baltic nations are buying the same old equipment from us to counter Russia, but the reality is simple drones have proven that maybe armor is useless. The Marines got rid of their armor just this past year. They said these are just big targets. Imagine, as a friend of mine told, we were having a conversation, said if the U.S. military had attacked the had attacked the Iraqis in the first war, or even the second war in Iraq, where Saddam had set up Fedayeen, and the Fedayeen had, in this case, Stingers, and they had tow missiles. It might not have been the best fight, and most of the fight now that is going to take place in Europe is not on big, huge landscapes. It ain't driving through a desert, and attacking, on the flanks of Iraqi armor. You're going into cities. And if I'm going to go into a city with a big tank, and that tank is nothing more than a death trap, whether it's an Abrams or is a Russian tank, because you have the ability of having some guy, who just barely got a drone in his hand and he knows how to fly it and has a armament on it, then you killed one of the most professional armies in the world, because you're able to use the type of technology that you could buy at a Walmart. When we were in the Mosul clearing operations between 2014 to 2017, and at the end of 2017, or in 2017, that was taking place, because I used to take the lessons learned from there, take him to Ravens Challenge Asiana, where my buddy Al Johnson at the time was a director, same Al Johnson who's on our board right now for the Near East. And we used to take those lessons learned to teach what are the changes that are taking place on the battlefield. And with a simple drone you could buy from a Walmart, you could have taken a 203 round, change the timing mechanism off of it using a rubber band and a paper clip. You had insurgents dropping a 123 round of a cheap drone and killing Iraqi special forces in bushels, and it would take hundreds of thousands of dollars to train these guys, and you got a simple way of just absolutely killing them. So the entire battlefield has completely changed, and I don't even know how you can even do any type of a security monitoring even in the homeland based on what is happening and the lessons that are being learned today in Ukraine. So the Ukraine war has completely changed how we can sanction people, what global economies are going to look like, and you can see a small force structure who's capable and can actually go against a superpower. And now the only thing the superpower has to retaliate would be the possibility of using tactical nukes in the future. I hope they don't use them, but that's some of the issues that we have to deal with going into the future. Flavius, I'm going to give you the last word. I talk usually more than I like to, but I was trying to answer the question that you had asked. But I'm going to give you the last word. Let's close out this first part, and then we'll bring you back up for the second part again next Thursday.
Thanks very much, Colonel, and the audience. Yeah, I think
you get the floor, buddy.
The nuances and understanding that you do have. Thank you. You do have this history of the European identity of Russia, and you see that with those mixed families today who are being divided. This is not a war that we think of in terms of the Second World War, where you have people against two civilizations against each other, and it makes it even more painful. The passing of Secretary Madeleine Albright, I think, is also symbolical of that. Perhaps why I'm somehow hopeful of that change of generation. The folks like Madeleine Albright came through the experience of Russia as the Soviet Union, right? And that was their mental model. And hopefully, you cannot blame them in some ways, like my parents' generation, for being traumatized by Russia. But that, in some respects, prevents you from having that more granular perspective of the role of diplomacy, for example. And I'm hoping that the new generation will not have lived through that trauma, but not necessarily being naive, will nonetheless have a bit larger aperture when handling situations that are complex, multi-layered, like Ukraine.
No, definitely, and I'm glad you brought Madeleine Albright, name into the process. Everything started from that fact that we had 500,000 Iraqi children that died because of the sanctions we put on against the Iraq regime. And finally, we had to actually literally invade Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein. And I'm not sure if the sanctions that are against Russia, even though their nuclear options, are going to have the type of effect. They may make the Russian Federation at the level of a Pakistan. Its economy is at that level, but they're a nuclear power just like Pakistan is. But I'm not sure if it's going to, change the equation on the ground that NATO wants to see. That's why they're pushing so hard for you Ukrainians to strike a peace deal with Putin, even though Ukrainians are saying, "Well, we can win. Look at how this technology is allowing us to defeat a nuclear power." But let's see how it turns out. It's definitely a new changes in how the globe is gonna conduct future wars and how it's gonna conduct future economic battles in order to be able to keep everybody in line when it comes to what the agreements that they had struck on were already. But I'm glad we're going to bring you in next week, get into a little bit more of a deep dive. I do want to let people know a little bit about work. If they want to, follow you, where can they go to follow you?
Thank you. I'm on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way with the DM direct message toggle on, so you can send direct message. I would be happy to continue the conversation offline and online on Twitter. I believe you have the QR codes for folks. If you want to take a snapshot of the QR code, they will be direct them toward my Twitter. And you have it on the screen. Thank you, Colonel.
No, definitely. We got the QR code on the bottom. On the screen. No, it's a pleasure to have you here, buddy. It's a pleasure to have you here. And for our audiences, no, definitely. And for our audiences, we are raising money also for us. If you like the type of programming we run for United of Sunni Appeal, it's very important this year. Really, we're concentrating on helping out in South Sudan. Again, the World Food Program moved from South Sudan to try to help the people in Afghanistan. Again, the projected numbers are we may lose 1.8 million because of the famine that has already hit them and the harsh winter that they're dealing with. And as you all heard at the beginning of the podcast, President Biden mentioning that there's going to be a global famine that's going to affect everybody again. And it's not just the fact that prices are going up. The war does cause famine in this case. And global wars definitely cause a famine. So support us if you can with United Sunni Appeal. And again, thanks to Sim Production for the type of work it does that gives us an opportunity to have these quality guests like my dear friend here with us today. And with that said, God bless you all. We'll see you next week. And this is New Paradigms.